The industrial conglomerate's decades of environmental cover-ups, Honeywell International. When you think of corporate malfeasance, your mind might drift to financial fraud or accounting scandals. But some of the most devastating crimes committed by corporations aren't measured in stolen dollars. They're measured in poisoned communities, contaminated groundwater, and lives cut short by toxic exposure. Today, we're examining Honeywell International, a Fortune 100 company that spent 7 decades systematically concealing environmental contamination while spending millions to fight the very regulations designed to protect public health. This isn't just a story about corporate greed. It's a masterclass in how a multinational conglomerate can weaponize science, manipulate regulators, and sacrifice entire communities for profit. Honeywell's environmental crimes begin in the 1950s, but to understand the full scope of their deception, we need to trace their corporate evolution. The company we know today emerged from a series of mergers, most notably with Allied Chemical Corporation in 1999, creating Allied Signal, which then acquired Honeywell and adopted its name. This corporate shell game becomes crucial to understanding how they evaded responsibility for decades of contamination. Allied Chemical had been one of America's largest producers of chromium chemicals since the 1920s, operating facilities that would become some of the most contaminated sites in the United States. When Jersey City officials discovered that Allied's chromium waste had been used as fill material throughout the city, they found chromium levels up to 58,000 parts per million in residential areas, nearly 300 times the EPA's acceptable limit. The company had essentially turned an entire city into a toxic waste dump, using their industrial refuse as cheap construction material and selling it to unsuspecting developers and homeowners. The chromium contamination in Jersey City represents just the tip of Honeywell's environmental iceberg. Internal company documents later revealed that Allied Chemical knew as early as the 1960s that hexavalent chromium, the same chemical made infamous in the Aaron Brockovich case, was causing severe health problems in their workers and surrounding communities. Yet instead of addressing the contamination, they embarked on a sophisticated campaign of concealment and denial. Company scientists were instructed to downplay health risks in their reports, and when independent researchers began linking chromium exposure to cancer and other serious illnesses, Honeywell funded counter-studies designed to muddy the scientific waters. They hired prominent toxicologists to author papers questioning the link between chromium and cancer, often without disclosing Honeywell's financial backing. This strategy of manufacturing doubt would become a hallmark of their environmental cover-ups, borrowed directly from the tobacco industry's playbook of denying scientific consensus to avoid liability. The scope of Honeywell's contamination extends far beyond chromium. At their Metropolis, Illinois facility, the company processed uranium for nuclear weapons production from 1958 to 1991, creating what would become one of the most contaminated sites in the American Midwest. The facility released an estimated 170,000 pounds of uranium into the air over 3 decades, with contamination levels in some areas measuring 100 times higher than EPA standards. But perhaps most shocking was Honeywell's response when environmental regulators began investigating. Rather than cooperating with cleanup efforts, company lawyers argued that because the contamination occurred during weapons production for the federal government, the taxpayers, not Honeywell, should bear the cost of remediation. They successfully delayed cleanup efforts for over a decade while continuing to operate the facility, generating millions in revenue while the surrounding community remained exposed to dangerous levels of radioactivity. When the EPA finally ordered a comprehensive cleanup in 2010, Honeywell faced a bill exceeding $1.8 billion, making it one of the most expensive environmental remediation projects in American history. The company's pattern of environmental deception wasn't limited to their most notorious sites. In Minneapolis, Honeywell inherited liability for a former pesticide and herbicide manufacturing plant that contaminated groundwater with arsenic and other toxins. The contamination plume stretched for miles underground, affecting residential neighborhoods and commercial districts. Internal memos from the 1970s show that company executives were fully aware of the groundwater contamination, but chose to keep operating rather than invest in proper waste treatment systems. When Minnesota environmental regulators began investigating in the 1980s, Honeywell employed a team of lawyers and consultants whose primary job was to minimize the apparent scope of contamination and shift blame to previous owners and operators. They challenged every aspect of the state's investigation, from sampling methodologies to health risk assessments, turning what should have been a straightforward cleanup into a decades-long legal battle. The contamination wasn't fully addressed until 2008, more than 30 years after Honeywell first became aware of the problem. What makes Honeywell's environmental crimes particularly insidious is how they used their political influence to shape environmental policy, while simultaneously violating environmental laws. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, as Congress was crafting landmark environmental legislation, like the Clean Air Act and Superfund law, Honeywell maintained one of Washington's most powerful lobbying operations. They spent millions annually on campaign contributions and lobbying fees, cultivating relationships with key legislators and regulatory officials. Their lobbyists worked to weaken enforcement provisions, create loopholes for industrial polluters, and limit corporate liability for environmental damage. At the same time, they were publicly supporting reasonable environmental protections. Internal documents show they were privately strategizing about how to evade compliance and minimize cleanup costs. When the EPA's Superfund program identified Honeywell as a potentially responsible party at dozens of contaminated sites across the country, the company's response wasn't to clean up their mess. It was to hire armies of lawyers to challenge the program's legal authority and delay remediation for as long as possible. The human cost of Honeywell's environmental cover-ups becomes clear when you examine the communities most affected by their contamination. In Jersey City, epidemiological studies found elevated rates of lung cancer, mesothelioma, and other respiratory diseases in neighborhoods built on chromium-contaminated fill. Residents reported strange illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, children developing asthma at unusually high rates, and clusters of rare cancers that couldn't be coincidental. Yet when community groups demanded answers, Honeywell's response was to question the validity of these studies and fund their own research designed to show no causal link between their contamination and community health problems. They hired public relations firms to spread doubt about the science, funded community groups that would advocate for their positions, and even infiltrated citizen advisory committees with consultants posing as concerned residents. Near their Metropolis uranium facility, similar patterns emerged. Elevated cancer rates, unusual clusters of birth defects, and environmental health problems that seemed to correlate directly with proximity to Honeywell's operations. The financial engineering behind Honeywell's environmental strategy reveals the calculated nature of their deception. Rather than treating environmental compliance as a cost of doing business, they approached it as a profit center to be optimized. Company financial analysts calculated that the net present value of delaying cleanups through litigation was often greater than the cost of immediate remediation, even accounting for inflation and legal fees. They established special subsidiary companies to hold environmental liabilities, then structured these entities to be judgment-proof if major cleanup orders were issued. When faced with potential Superfund liability, they would sometimes shut down and dissolve subsidiaries, leaving behind orphaned contamination sites with no responsible party to fund cleanup. This approach allowed them to privatize the profits from decades of industrial production while socializing the environmental costs, forcing taxpayers and affected communities to bear the burden of their contamination. The regulatory response to Honeywell's environmental crimes has been a study in the limitations of American environmental enforcement. Despite clear evidence of decades-long cover-ups and deliberate contamination, the company has faced relatively modest penalties compared to the scope of their environmental damage. Their largest single environmental fine was $11.8 million in 2003 for violations at their Louisiana chemical plants, a sum that represented less than 48 hours of corporate revenue. Even when forced to pay for cleanup costs, Honeywell has successfully negotiated payment schedules that stretch over decades, allowing them to earn more in investment returns than they pay in remediation costs. The company has never faced criminal charges for their environmental cover-ups, despite clear evidence that executives knowingly concealed information about public health risks. This regulatory toothlessness has essentially made environmental crime a rational business decision for companies like Honeywell, where the expected value of fines and cleanup costs remains lower than the profits from continued contamination. As we conclude this examination of Honeywell's environmental crimes, it's worth considering what their case reveals about corporate environmental responsibility in America. Here we have a company that over 7 decades systematically poisoned communities, covered up scientific evidence, manipulated regulatory processes, and used their political influence to avoid accountability. Their contamination has affected hundreds of thousands of people, required billions in cleanup costs, and will continue causing environmental and health problems for generations to come. Yet Honeywell remains a profitable Fortune 100 company. Their executives face no criminal liability, and their stock price has steadily climbed, even as evidence of their environmental crimes has mounted. The Honeywell case demonstrates that in America's current regulatory environment, environmental crime pays, and it pays handsomely. Until we create enforcement mechanisms with real teeth and hold corporate executives personally accountable for environmental cover-ups, companies like Honeywell will continue to treat our air, water, and communities as free dumping grounds for their industrial waste. The only question is whether we'll continue to let them get away with it.